What does the Bible have to say about sex before marriage? Hey everybody, I'm Dan McClellan. I'm a scholar of the Bible and religion, and the fit for this video is the X-Men cartoon. And the Bible doesn't have a whole lot to say directly about sex before marriage, and what it does have to say is inconsistent and sometimes contradicting. And that's because each author is presenting their own sexual ethic based on their own social mores and conventions and circumstances. So there's no single consistent sexual ethic running from beginning to end. In the Hebrew Bible, there's no real sacrality associated with the act of sex itself. It is the social implications that are the primary driver of the regulations that are placed on sex. And if you had to distill the sexual ethics of the Hebrew Bible down to the shortest list of principles, it would probably be that sex before marriage should only happen if it ends up in marriage. And also, men can visit sex workers without any problem as long as they're not attached to Adonai, to a temple or cult or priesthood or something like that. Because women were viewed as sexual commodities, and so their sexual integrity and purity was what they were primarily paying for when they paid the bride price. So women were expected to be virgins. Now, as I've said in many videos before, men were the sexual agents anciently. Women were passive sexual objects. Their agency and their consent didn't really matter. Sexual agency only flowed downhill. So if a man wanted to have sex with an unmarried, unbetrothed woman, nothing prohibited that. But it did mean that he was expected to marry her because she has lost her sexual integrity or purity according to ancient Israelite society and would be considered damaged goods on the open market, so to speak. And so it wasn't the act itself, but the social implications of the act. And we get into Greco Roman period Judaism, we achieve a bit more parity regarding expectations associated with sexual behavior between men and women. And that's because Greco Roman period Judaism is adopting a more Greek philosophical outlook about sexual desire, seeing it as a more base urge of our fleshly existence, something that is only appropriate within very narrow, restricted confines and totally inappropriate outside of those confines. And so different authors approach this in different ways. Some suggest that sex is only appropriate if it is intentionally for the act of procreation. So the Hebrew Bible prohibits sex during menstruation. Some Greco-Roman period Jewish authors expand that to include sex during pregnancy, sex after a woman is no longer able to conceive. Some say you're not even allowed to enjoy it when you're engaged in sex for the purposes of procreation. Others are a little more lenient, say, hey, they can engage in sex when they're old if they're able to. That's not a big deal. And others are more strict. And then we get into the New Testament and we have this idea that celibacy is the higher law. Authors like Paul and probably the author of Matthew and probably others thought that Jesus was coming back too soon to worry about procreation. And so the narrow confines of appropriate sex that they carved out were within marriage for the sake of keeping the sexual urges under control so that they don't run wild and result in sexual sin. Now, the principle of porneia, fornication as it's usually translated in the New Testament, was kind of a grab bag of illicit sexual activities. Fundamentally, it had to do with adultery and sex work. However, it could refer to anything that a social group considered to be an illicit sexual act. And so it was different from social group to social group. I would say that for the majority of New Testament authors, it almost certainly would have included premarital sex, particularly for those more philosophically minded authors who were in the sex is only appropriate to keep down the urges school. But there were probably others who thought it was not as big a deal, but we don't know for sure because they don't directly address the question. We have to piece it together from the clues that are available. And the more we try to read our own sexual ethic into the Bible in order to authorize and arrogate the authority of the Bible to our own sexual ethic, the more we're just negotiating with the Bible rather than allowing the biblical authors to try to operate on their own terms. When we do that, what we see is pluriformity and conflict and very different ideas about premarital sex. Now, if you'd like further reading regarding sexuality and sexual ethics in the ancient world and in the Bible, here is the one-page bibliography I produced for my online class on homosexuality and the Bible. And if you're interested in purchasing the recording of that class, you can find it at mcclellan.org.